The evening air in Tulsa, Oklahoma hung thick with the copper scent of coming rain on October 5th, 1954. And inside Hillcrest Medical Center, Dr. Noboru Schlesinger stood over the body of 58-year-old Samuel Doss with a frown cutting deep lines across his forehead. The toxicology report trembled slightly in his hands, not from nerves, but from the sheer impossibility of what he was reading. Samuel Doss had arrived at this very hospital just 23 days earlier, doubled over with severe intestinal distress, his skin yellowed, his eyes hollow, his gut twisted with pain that no amount of morphine could fully quiet. The doctors had treated him, stabilized him, watched him recover enough to walk out through the front doors on his own 2 legs. Samuel Doss had been released on September 28th with a clean bill of health. His wife, a plump, pleasant woman named Nannie, who had visited every single day with a homemade thermos of stewed prunes and gentle smiles for the nursing staff, had collected him with tears of joy in her eyes. She had driven him home to their modest house on East Newton Street. 7 days later, Samuel Doss was dead. And now, staring at the laboratory results, Dr. Schlesinger understood why. The man's organs contained enough arsenic to kill 20 men. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The death certificate had been ready. The funeral arrangements had been made. Mrs. Nannie Doss had already selected the casket, a modest pine box, nothing too expensive, because Samuel wouldn't have wanted anything flashy, and she had notified his lodge brothers at the Elks Club, and she had dabbed at her eyes with a lace-trimmed handkerchief while accepting condolences from the neighbors who stopped by with covered dishes and whispered sympathies. She had done everything a grieving widow was supposed to do, and she had done it with a warm, patient smile that made everyone around her feel that she was handling her loss with remarkable Christian grace. But Dr. Schlesinger had refused to sign that death certificate. Something had nagged at him from the moment Samuel Doss was wheeled back into the emergency room on October 5th, already slipping into the gray twilight between life and death. Something about the speed of the collapse. Something about the way a man who had been healthy enough to walk out of the hospital 6 days earlier had suddenly returned looking like a corpse that had simply forgotten to stop breathing. Dr. Schlesinger had ordered the autopsy against the widow's wishes. She had protested, gently at first, then with increasing agitation, asking why they couldn't just let Samuel rest in peace, and now he understood why she had been so insistent. Nannie Doss had killed her husband. She had killed him slowly, deliberately, with poison stirred into his food and his drinks, and she had done it while smiling and laughing and asking the nurses if they thought her husband was comfortable enough. The Tulsa Police Department received a telephone call from Hillcrest Medical Center at 6:47 p.m. on October 6, 1954. By 8:30 that same evening, 2 detectives, Captain Harry Steege and Sergeant Ben Adams, were sitting in the cramped living room of 507 East Newton Street, across from a 50-year-old woman who weighed nearly 200 pounds and who had not stopped smiling since she had opened the front door and welcomed them inside as though they were old friends stopping by for a social call. The house smelled of coffee and cinnamon, and somewhere in the kitchen a pot bubbled on the stove. The detectives had declined her offer of refreshments. They had declined politely but firmly. And Nannie Doss had simply shrugged her soft shoulders and settled into an overstuffed armchair and folded her hands in her lap and asked them what she could possibly do to help. She was not what they had expected. Serial killers, in the limited experience of the Tulsa Police Department, were supposed to be wild-eyed and twitchy, were supposed to give themselves away with nervous tics and evasive answers and the unmistakable stench of guilt. Nannie Doss was none of these things. She answered their questions directly. She maintained eye contact. She laughed, a high, girlish giggle that seemed almost absurdly out of place given the circumstances, when they asked her about the last meals she had prepared for her husband. Stewed prunes. That was what she had brought Samuel in the hospital. Stewed prunes because he had been having trouble with his digestion. and everyone knew that prunes were good for that sort of thing, and she had sweetened them with a little extra sugar because Samuel had always had a sweet tooth. God rest his soul. The detectives exchanged a look. Outside, the rain had finally started to fall, drumming against the windows in sheets that made the cozy living room feel suddenly very small and very close. "Mrs. Doss," Captain Steger said carefully, "I need to ask you about your previous husbands." And Nannie Doss laughed again, that same high, tinkling giggle, and said, "Oh my, where do you want me to start?" The story of Nannie Doss begins not in Tulsa, but in Blue Mountain, Alabama, a tiny hamlet nestled in the foothills of the Appalachians, where the soil was thin and rocky, and the families who scratched a living from it were made of harder stuff than most. She was born Nancy Hazel on November 4th, 1905, the first daughter and second child of James Hazel, a farmer with a permanent squint and a leather strap he was not afraid to use, and his wife Louisa, a woman who had learned early in her marriage that the best way to survive was to keep her head down and her mouth shut. The Hazel family was poor, not the romantic kind of poor that gets softened in memory, but the grinding, relentless kind that wears grooves into the soul, and James Hazel worked his children like mules almost from the moment they could walk. There were 5 children in total: James Jr., Nancy, Dorothy, Lee, and the baby, who died before her first birthday from what the doctor in the nearest town called failure to thrive, but what everyone in Blue Mountain understood to be a consequence of too little food and too much cold, and the simple cruelty of circumstance that claimed so many babies in that part of the country in those years. Nancy Hazel grew up hungry. She grew up tired. She grew up watching her mother wilt under the weight of endless labor and her father's heavy hand. And she grew up knowing in some deep, wordless part of herself that she wanted something different, something more. The Hazel children were rarely allowed to attend school. James Hazel saw no point in book learning when there was cotton to be picked and hogs to be fed. But Nancy was bright, quick-minded, and desperate enough for escape that she taught herself to read by stealing glances at the family Bible and by bartering chores with a neighbor girl in exchange for the loan of her school books. She read everything she could get her hands on, which wasn't much. But what she read most avidly were the romance stories printed in the cheap magazines that occasionally made their way into Blue Mountain via traveling salesmen and passing trains. True romance, romantic story, modern love, these magazines, with their covers featuring stylized drawings of handsome men gazing adoringly at beautiful women, became Nancy Hazel's window into a world she had never known existed. A world where men brought flowers and whispered sweet nothings, and love was a grand adventure rather than a trap. She was 11 years old when the train accident happened. The Hazel family was traveling to visit relatives in another county, crammed into a passenger car that rattled and swayed over tracks that had seen better days, when the train lurched suddenly and threw little Nancy headfirst into the metal bar of the seat in front of her. She remembered the impact. A flash of white light, a sound like a watermelon being dropped on concrete, and then nothing until she woke up in her own bed 3 days later with a headache that felt like someone had driven a railroad spike through her skull. The headache would become a constant companion. For the rest of her life, Nancy Hazel would suffer from blinding migraines, from bouts of depression that descended like black curtains, from what she herself would later describe as a kind of static in her brain that sometimes made it hard to think clearly. Whether the head injury actually caused these symptoms, or whether it simply became a convenient explanation for behaviors that had other, darker roots, is impossible to say at this remove. What is certain is that Nancy Hazel changed after the accident. She became moodier, more withdrawn, prone to long silences punctuated by sudden bursts of inappropriate laughter. The giggle that would later unnerve police detectives and courtroom spectators alike may have had its origins in that rattling train car in the Alabama hills. At 16, Nancy Hazel met Charles Braggs. He was 4 years older than her, handsome in a rough-hewn country way, with dark hair and a crooked smile, and a job at the local linen factory that seemed, to a girl who had never known anything but subsistence farming, like the height of sophistication. He started coming around the Hazel farm in the spring of 1921, and by summer, Nancy was sneaking out at night to meet him behind the barn. And by November, just days after her 16th birthday, they were married in a ceremony so hastily arranged that Nancy had to wear her Sunday dress because there was no time to make anything new. She didn't care. She was in love. She was going to have the kind of life she had read about in her magazines. She was going to be happy. The marriage soured almost immediately. Charles Braggs was not the romantic hero Nancy had imagined. He was sullen, often drunk, and devoted more attention to his pool hall buddies than to his new bride. Worse, his mother, a sharp-tongued widow named Harriet, who had opposed the marriage from the start, moved in with the young couple and made Nancy's life a misery with constant criticism and thinly veiled contempt. Nancy found herself, at 16, trapped in a situation that felt horribly, achingly familiar. She was still poor. She was still overworked. She was still under the thumb of people who seemed determined to grind her down. The only difference was that now she also had to share a bed with a man who treated her like an inconvenience rather than a partner. Between 1921 and 1927, Nancy Braggs gave birth to 4 daughters: Melvina, Florine, Levia, and an infant who was never named because she died too quickly before she could even leave the hospital. Or so the records claimed. Charles Braggs, looking back on those years decades later, would tell a different story. He would say that 2 of his children, the 2 middle girls, had died suddenly, mysteriously, within weeks of each other, and that Nancy had seemed wrong somehow, not grief-stricken enough, too composed. He would say that he had come home one evening to find Nancy sitting in the parlor with her hands folded in her lap and a strange, dreamy expression on her face, and that when he asked where the children were, she had simply shrugged and said that they had gone to sleep and wouldn't be waking up. He would say that he had been too afraid to ask questions, too afraid of what the answers might be. He divorced her in 1928, taking 1 daughter with him, Melvina, the eldest, the one he believed he could still save, and leaving Nancy with Florine, and a warning that if she ever came near him again, he would kill her. It was not an idle threat. Charles Braggs had seen something in his wife's eyes that terrified him, something flat and cold and utterly without remorse, and he had understood in that moment that the woman he had married was not quite human in all the ways that mattered. Nancy moved back to Blue Mountain. She got a job at the cotton mill. She began reading the Lonely Hearts columns that had started appearing in the back pages of her beloved romance magazines, advertisements placed by men and women seeking companionship, correspondence, love. The concept was simple. You wrote a letter describing yourself, paid a small fee to have it published, and then waited for responses from interested parties. It was mail-order romance for a new age, and Nancy Hazel Braggs, 23 years old and already a divorced mother with dead children in her past, saw it as her ticket to the life she still believed she deserved. She began writing letters. Frank Harrelson was a factory worker from Jacksonville, Alabama, a compact man with a drinker's nose and a charmer's tongue who had placed an advertisement seeking a kind-hearted woman for companionship and possible matrimony. Nancy answered his ad in the summer of 1929, and within months, they were exchanging increasingly passionate letters that promised everything and revealed nothing. Frank came to Blue Mountain to meet her in person that fall. He found a plump, pleasant woman with a warm laugh and an eagerness to please that he found deeply appealing. She found a man who seemed at first to be everything Charles Braggs had not been. Attentive, affectionate, full of promises about the life they would build together. They married in 1929, just as the stock market was crashing and the country was plunging into the worst economic depression in its history, and they settled into a small house in Jacksonville, where Nancy set about trying, once again, to build the life she had always dreamed of. It did not take long for the dream to curdle. Frank Harrelson, it turned out, was a drunk. Not a pleasant, sociable drunk, but a mean one. The kind who came home late smelling of whiskey and cheap perfume. The kind who raised his hand when dinner wasn't ready on time. The kind who spent his paycheck on liquor and gambling and left Nancy scrambling to keep the electricity on and food on the table. The charming suitor from the letters had been a performance, a mask that slipped the moment the wedding vows were spoken, and Nancy found herself trapped once again in a marriage that bore no resemblance to the romances she had spent her girlhood reading about. She endured. She had Florine to think about, and then 2 more daughters who were born in quick succession. Babies who arrived squalling into a household that grew more chaotic and violent with each passing year. She cleaned, she cooked, she smiled, and she began to think, in the dark, quiet hours of the night, when Frank was passed out and the children were sleeping, about how much simpler life would be if Frank simply wasn't there anymore. The years passed. The depression ground on. Nancy Harrelson grew plumper, her face settling into the round, soft contours that would later be described as grandmotherly, her manner becoming increasingly placid and pleasant, even as her marriage descended into routine brutality. She continued to read her romance magazines. She continued to dream. And she watched. She watched her mother-in-law, who had moved in with them, and who had immediately made clear her opinion of Nancy as a wife and housekeeper. She watched her grandson, Melvina's boy, who had come to stay with them when Melvina fell on hard times, with a strange, calculating attention that Melvina would later struggle to articulate to investigators. There was something wrong with the way Mother looked at that baby, Melvina would say. Something hungry. In 1945, 2 things happened that would change the course of Nancy Harrelson's life forever. First, in the spring of that year, Melvina gave birth to her second child, a baby boy she named Robert. The delivery was difficult, and Melvina was groggy from the ether that the doctor had administered, drifting in and out of consciousness as her mother and a neighbor woman attended to the newborn. Later, Melvina would swear that she had seen something, had opened her eyes at the wrong moment, and had witnessed her mother doing something to the baby, something with her hands, something that made no sense in the fog of drugs and pain. She had tried to speak, to scream, but the ether had pulled her back under before she could make a sound. When she woke again, the baby was dead. The doctor had been called. Nancy was weeping quietly, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, explaining that the child had simply stopped breathing. One of those terrible tragedies that no one could explain. Crib death, the doctor had said, shaking his head sadly. It happened sometimes. Nothing could have been done. Melvina had tried to tell someone, had grabbed her sister's arm and whispered about what she thought she had seen. But Nancy had overheard, and Nancy had explained, patiently and kindly, that Melvina had been hallucinating from the ether, that the grief was making her imagine terrible things, that of course Nancy would never harm a baby. What kind of monster did Melvina think she was? And Melvina, still weak from childbirth, still reeling from the loss of her son, had let herself be convinced. Or at least, she had let herself stop asking questions. 2 months later, Melvina's other child, her firstborn son, a toddler, died in his sleep. Nancy had been caring for him while Melvina recovered. The official cause of death was asphyxia. No one ordered an autopsy. No one asked difficult questions. Nancy cried at the funeral, her broad shoulders shaking with sobs, and everyone said what a blessing it was that Melvina had such a devoted mother to help her through this unimaginable tragedy. The second thing that happened in 1945 was that Frank Harrelson died. It happened in September, just as the war was ending and the whole country was drunk on victory and relief. Frank had been feeling poorly for weeks, stomach cramps, vomiting, the kind of intestinal distress that was common enough in rural Alabama that no one thought much of it. Nancy had nursed him devotedly, bringing him soup and tea and the stewed prunes that she swore would settle his digestion. She had sat by his bedside through the long nights, wiping his brow with cool cloths, murmuring soothing words as he writhed in agony. And then, on a muggy September evening, while the radio was playing news of the Japanese surrender, Frank Harrelson had drawn a final, rattling breath and died. The doctor, who had not seen the patient until it was far too late to do anything, wrote food poisoning on the death certificate. It was plausible enough. Bad meat, improperly stored, could kill a man. These things happened. Nancy Harrelson collected a small life insurance payout, barely enough to cover the funeral expenses, and she dried her eyes, and she packed her bags, and she left Jacksonville without looking back. She was 40 years old. She'd been married twice. She had buried 2 husbands, though one had merely been divorced, 2 infant children, or perhaps more, depending on what you believed, 2 grandchildren, and God only knew who else. And she was ready at last to find the love she had been searching for all her life. The Lonely Hearts columns had evolved since Nancy had first discovered them in the 1920s. There were more of them now, published in newspapers and magazines across the country, and the advertisements had grown more elaborate, more specific, more shameless in their promises. Gentleman farmer, 45, seeks affectionate companion for marriage, read one. Widow financially secure, desires correspondence with lonely woman, read another. Nancy placed her own advertisements in several publications, describing herself as a middle-aged widow. She neglected to mention the divorces. Cheerful disposition, true enough. Seeking mature gentlemen for friendship and possible matrimony, definitely true. The responses came flooding in. Dozens of letters from lonely men across the South, men whose wives had died or left or simply never existed, men who saw in Nancy's carefully composed words the promise of companionship and comfort. She wrote back to all of them. She cultivated relationships. She weighed her options with the calculating attention of a horse trader at auction. Arlie Lanning won. He was a resident of Lexington, North Carolina, a quiet town that had grown up around the furniture factories that lined the Yadkin River. He was 53 years old, a bit soft around the middle, recently widowed, and desperately lonely in the way that only men who have spent decades being cared for by women can be lonely when they suddenly find themselves alone. His letters to Nancy were awkward, earnest, full of misspelled words and grammatical errors that revealed a limited education, but also a genuine desire for connection. He told her about his house, about his job, about the garden he was trying to maintain, even though he had never had much of a green thumb. He told her that he thought she seemed like a fine woman. He told her that he would be honored if she would consider coming to Lexington to meet him in person. Nancy arrived in Lexington in the spring of 1947, and 3 days later, she and Arlie Lanning were married. The marriage to Arlie was, by all accounts, the happiest of Nancy's unions, at least for the first year or 2. Arlie was kind, docile, devoted to his new wife in a way that Frank Harrelson had never been. He didn't drink to excess. He didn't raise his hand. He went to work at the furniture factory, and he came home for dinner. And he sat with Nancy on the front porch in the evenings and talked about nothing in particular, while the fireflies rose from the grass and the smell of honeysuckle drifted on the warm Carolina air. Nancy joined the local Methodist church. She made friends with the neighbors. She baked pies and entered them in the county fair and won a blue ribbon that she displayed proudly on the mantelpiece. She seemed to everyone who knew her to be exactly what she appeared, a pleasant, plump, middle-aged woman who had finally found the domestic contentment she deserved. But there were cracks beneath the surface. Arlie, it turned out, was not as financially secure as his letters had suggested. The house was mortgaged. The furniture factory had cut back his hours. And worst of all, from Nancy's perspective, he was spending money on a mistress, a younger woman from the next town over who Arlie visited on weekends when he told Nancy he was going fishing. Nancy found out. Nancy always found out. And Nancy, who had endured so much abuse and so much disappointment, who had pinned all her dreams on this quiet man in his quiet house in his quiet town, felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest. In 1950, Arlie's mother came to visit. She was an elderly widow named Sarah Lanning, frail and easily confused, and she planned to stay for just a few weeks while she recovered from a minor illness. 2 days after her arrival, Sarah Lanning was dead. The cause was listed as heart failure. Nancy organized the funeral, selected the casket, received the mourners with her usual warm smile. Arlie was devastated by the loss. Nancy was comforting. She brought him tea. She rubbed his shoulders. She told him that everything would be all right. Arlie Lanning died in February of 1952 of what the doctor described as heart failure complicated by pneumonia. He had been sick for months, the same grinding intestinal illness that had claimed Frank Harrelson, the same inexorable decline that seemed to begin suddenly and progress inevitably toward death. Nancy had nursed him through it all, patient and devoted, spooning broth into his trembling mouth and changing the sheets when he soiled them, and never once complaining about the burden. The neighbors marveled at her dedication. The church ladies brought casseroles and praised her Christian charity. And when Arlie finally stopped breathing, when the doctor arrived and shook his head sadly and said that there was nothing more that could have been done, Nancy wept and thanked them all for their kindness, and began, even before the funeral arrangements were finalized, to calculate her next move. She collected the life insurance. It was more substantial than what she had received from Frank, though still not enough to live on indefinitely. She also collected a small inheritance from Arlie's mother. Sarah had changed her will shortly before her death, leaving everything to the daughter-in-law she had known for only 2 days. And then, just weeks after the funeral, the house caught fire. It was a total loss. Nancy, who had been visiting friends in town at the time, was devastated, or so she told the insurance adjuster who came to assess the damage. She collected the fire insurance payout as well. And then she moved on. The next husband was Richard Morton, a retired businessman from Emporia, Kansas, who had placed an advertisement in a Lonely Hearts publication seeking a refined woman of mature years for companionship and possible matrimony. Nancy answered his ad in the summer of 1952. They exchanged letters through the fall. Richard came to visit her in North Carolina in November, and he was so charmed by her warmth, by her easy laughter, by the home-cooked meals she prepared, and the obvious care she took in making him feel welcome, that he proposed before he returned to Kansas. They were married in January of 1953. Richard Morton was, in many ways, the most promising of Nancy's husbands. He was financially comfortable, with a pension from his years in business and savings enough to provide a stable, secure retirement. He was gentle, educated, and genuinely interested in Nancy as a person. He asked about her past. He listened to her stories. He held her hand during church services and told her that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. For a few months, Nancy seemed content. She settled into Richard's comfortable house in Kansas. She joined the local Methodist church. She made friends with the neighbors. And she began, almost immediately, to complain. Richard, she told anyone who would listen, was too controlling. He didn't let her manage the household finances. He questioned her spending. He didn't appreciate all the work she did around the house. The complaints seemed, to those who heard them, like the ordinary grumblings of any long-married couple, nothing serious, nothing worth worrying about. But Nancy's complaints had a particular intensity, a simmering resentment that seemed disproportionate to the mild-mannered man she was married to. Richard Morton, for his part, seemed bewildered by his wife's discontent. He loved her. He told her so constantly. He didn't understand what he was doing wrong. In March of 1953, Nancy Doss, she was using her maiden name again, had been for years, because it was simpler than explaining all the husbands, withdrew several $100s from the joint bank account she shared with Richard Morton and used it to purchase a life insurance policy. The policy was in Richard's name. The beneficiary was Nancy. Richard Morton never knew the policy existed. He died in May of 1953, 3 months after the wedding. The cause of death was listed as heart failure. He had been suffering from stomach troubles for weeks, cramping, vomiting, the same cluster of symptoms that had claimed Frank Harrelson and Arlie Lanning before him. Nancy had nursed him devotedly. She had brought him tea and broth and stewed prunes. She had sat by his bedside and held his hand and whispered reassurances as he slipped away. And then she had collected the life insurance and begun, once again, to scan the Lonely Hearts columns for her next husband. She found Samuel Doss in the summer of 1953. He was a highway inspector from Tulsa, Oklahoma, a devout Christian who taught Sunday school and belonged to the local Elks Lodge, and had placed an advertisement seeking a good Christian woman for companionship and marriage. Nancy answered his ad immediately. Samuel was everything she claimed to be looking for: respectable, employed, religious, lonely in a way that made him easy to manipulate. They exchanged letters through the summer and fall. Samuel came to Kansas to meet her in person. He was impressed by her cheerfulness, by her apparent piety, by the home-cooked meals she prepared, and the obvious care she took in making him feel comfortable. They were married in June of 1953, in a small ceremony at the Methodist Church in Tulsa, and Nancy moved into Samuel's modest house on East Newton Street and began her 5th marriage. From the beginning, there were problems. Samuel Doss, it turned out, was not the pushover that Nancy's previous husbands had been. He was frugal, almost pathologically so, and he insisted on controlling every aspect of the household finances. He disapproved of Nancy's spending habits. He disapproved of her romance magazines, which he considered frivolous and unchristian. He disapproved of the radio programs she liked to listen to, the popular music she enjoyed, the occasional glass of wine she had with dinner. He was a man of rigid habits and unbending morality, and he expected his wife to conform to his standards without question. Nancy, who had endured far worse from far worse men, initially tried to comply. She attended church twice a week. She gave up her magazines. She stopped listening to the radio when Samuel was home. But the resentment built, slow and steady, like water rising behind a dam. In September of 1954, Samuel Doss became ill. The symptoms were, by now, terribly familiar: cramping, vomiting, intestinal distress so severe that he could barely stand. Nancy called the doctor. Samuel was admitted to Hillcrest Medical Center on September 14th. The doctors examined him, ran tests, scratched their heads over the peculiar constellation of symptoms that didn't quite fit any obvious diagnosis. They treated him for what they suspected was a severe gastric infection. They kept him under observation. And Nancy visited every single day, bringing her homemade stewed prunes, chatting pleasantly with the nurses, asking solicitously after her husband's condition. Samuel recovered. Or rather, he seemed to recover. His symptoms subsided. His color improved. On September 28th, the doctors released him with instructions to rest and to follow up if the symptoms returned. Nancy drove him home. She made him dinner. She brought him a cup of coffee to help him sleep, or so she said later, when asked why she had given a man a caffeinated beverage at bedtime. Samuel drank the coffee. He complained that it tasted strange, and within hours, he was sick again, sicker than before, sicker than he had ever been in his life. By the time the ambulance returned him to Hillcrest Medical Center on October 5th, Samuel Doss was dying. He passed away that same evening, and Dr. Noboru Schwesinger, The attending physician who had treated him during his previous stay stood over the body and refused to sign the death certificate. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. Dr. Schlesinger ordered an autopsy. The results came back on October 6th. Samuel Doss's organs were saturated with arsenic, massive quantities of it, enough to have killed him several times over. The poison had accumulated in his system over a period of weeks, building up with each dose until his body simply couldn't process it anymore. Someone had been feeding him arsenic, slowly and deliberately, in the food and drink that was supposed to heal him. And the only person who had been preparing Samuel Doss's food, the only person who had access to him both at home and in the hospital, was his devoted wife, Nannie. The arrest took place on the evening of October 7th, 1954. Captain Harry Steger and Sergeant Ben Adams had spent the previous 24 hours gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, piecing together the strange and disturbing history of the woman who now sat across from them in the cramped living room of 507 East Newton Street. They had discovered, to their growing horror, that Nannie Doss had been married not once or twice, but 4 times before Samuel, and that each of her previous husbands had died under circumstances that now seemed far less natural than they had at the time. They had discovered that children had died in Nannie's care, grandchildren, possibly her own children as well. They had discovered a trail of death that stretched back 3 decades and across half a dozen states, a body count that was still being tabulated and that seemed to grow with each new revelation. And yet the woman who sat across from them, her hands folded primly in her lap, her round face creased in an expression of mild puzzlement, seemed utterly unconcerned. She answered their questions directly and without hesitation. She smiled. She laughed, that high, girlish giggle that made the detective's skin crawl. When they pressed her on inconsistencies in her story, she simply shrugged and offered alternative explanations that were no more plausible, but were delivered with such unshakable confidence that it was hard to know how to respond. She did not ask for a lawyer. She did not invoke her rights. She seemed more than anything to be enjoying herself. It was nearly midnight when Captain Steege finally confronted her directly. "Mrs. Doss," he said, "we have the autopsy results. We know your husband was poisoned. We know you did it. The only question now is why." And Nannie Doss, the woman who would soon be known to newspapers across America as the Giggling Granny and the Jolly Black Widow, looked up at the detective with her round, pleasant face and her grandmother's smile and said, "Well, I was looking for the perfect mate, the real romance of life, but I never found it." Then she giggled. The confession that followed lasted several hours and would later be described by Captain Steger as the most disturbing experience of his 20-year career in law enforcement. Nannie Doss admitted to killing Samuel Doss with arsenic, which she had purchased at a local hardware store under the pretense of needing it for rat poison. She admitted to killing Richard Morton the same way. She admitted to killing Arlie Lanning, to killing Frank Harrelson, to killing her mother-in-law Sarah Lanning, and her grandson, and her other grandson, who had died as an infant in 1945. She spoke of each death calmly, almost cheerfully, as though she were recounting the plots of the romance novels she loved to read, rather than confessing to multiple homicides. She explained her methods. The rat poison stirred into coffee, the arsenic sprinkled over stewed prunes, the slow accumulation of poison that mimicked natural illness and avoided suspicion. She explained her motives. Disappointment, mostly. None of the men had lived up to her expectations. None of them had provided the romantic fulfillment she had been seeking all her life. And so she had disposed of them, one after another, and moved on to the next Lonely Hearts advertisement in search of a man who would finally make her happy. "What about the children?" Captain Steger asked, his voice barely steady. "Why did you kill the children?" Nannie Doss's smile flickered, just for a moment, and something cold and distant passed behind her eyes. "I don't remember," she said. And then the smile returned, bright and warm, and utterly without remorse. The newspapers descended on Tulsa like locusts. The story was simply too good, too strange, too shocking, too perfect for the sensationalist journalism of the era to ignore. "Grandmother admits killing 11, screamed the front page of the Tulsa Tribune. "Jolly Widow giggled as she confessed," reported the Daily Oklahoman. "Lonely Heart's killer sought perfect mate," announced the wire services. And the story was picked up by papers across the country. Nannie Doss became, overnight, the most famous murderer in America. She seemed to enjoy the attention. During the weeks following her arrest, Nannie gave numerous interviews to reporters who flocked to the Tulsa County Jail for a glimpse of the giggling grandmother who had poisoned her way through 4 marriages. She was charming, cooperative, utterly at ease in the spotlight. She posed for photographs, smiling that warm, grandmotherly smile that had put so many victims at ease. She joked with reporters about her crimes, giggling at her own dark humor as though she were discussing nothing more serious than a recipe gone wrong. When one reporter asked her if she had any regrets, she thought for a moment and then said, "Only that I didn't have more fun while I was doing it." The quote was published in newspapers across the country. It became one of the defining images of the case. The unrepentant grandmother, the giggling murderess, the woman who had killed without conscience and laughed about it afterward. But the reality of Nannie Doss was, as always, more complicated than the headlines suggested. The psychiatrists who examined her in the weeks before her trial painted a portrait of a woman profoundly damaged by a lifetime of abuse, neglect, and disappointment. Her childhood had been brutal. The beatings from her father, the grinding poverty, the train accident that may or may not have caused lasting brain damage. Her marriages had been disasters, drunken, abusive men who had used her and discarded her, who had failed to provide even a fraction of the romance she had been promised by her beloved magazines. She had grown up believing that love was supposed to be a certain way, tender, passionate, all-consuming, and when reality failed to match her expectations, she had responded with violence. The giggling, the psychiatrists suggested, was a defense mechanism, a way of distancing herself from the horror of what she had done. Deep down, they believed, Nannie Doss was not a monster, but a deeply damaged human being, a victim of circumstances who had become a victimizer in turn. Others were less sympathetic. The prosecutors painted Nannie as a cold, calculating predator, a woman who had deliberately sought out vulnerable men through Lonely Hearts columns, had married them for their money and their life insurance, and had murdered them when they failed to provide the financial security she craved. The romance, they argued, was a facade. The search for the perfect mate was a cover story. What Nannie Doss really wanted was money, independence, and the thrill of getting away with murder. She was not crazy. She was not damaged. She was simply evil. The trial began in May of 1955, and it was, from the beginning, more of a formality than a genuine contest. Nannie had confessed to multiple homicides. The physical evidence, particularly the arsenic found in Samuel Doss's organs, was overwhelming. Her defense attorneys, appointed by the court, after she made clear she could not afford her own counsel, faced an impossible task. They could not deny that Nannie had killed her husband. They could only argue about the degree of her culpability, about whether she was legally insane at the time of the murders, about whether she deserved execution or life imprisonment. Oklahoma was one of the few states in the nation that had never executed a woman. The last time the issue had come up, the governor had commuted the sentence rather than see a woman walk to the electric chair. Nannie's attorneys leaned heavily on this precedent, arguing that while their client was clearly guilty, she should be spared the death penalty for reasons of tradition and mercy. The prosecution pushed for execution regardless, arguing that the sheer number of Nannie's victims, at least 11 people by her own confession, demanded the ultimate punishment. In the end, the jury split the difference. Nannie Doss was found guilty of murder in the first degree. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As the verdict was read, she sat at the defense table with her hands folded in her lap and that same warm, grandmotherly smile on her face. She did not cry. She did not react. She simply nodded, as though the outcome had been exactly what she expected, and allowed the bailiffs to lead her away. She spent the remaining years of her life in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, a sprawling complex of brick buildings and guard towers that house some of the most dangerous criminals in the state. In prison, Nannie became something of a celebrity. She gave interviews to journalists and true crime writers who sought her out. She corresponded with fans, yes, fans, who had followed her case in the newspapers and who wrote to her seeking advice, confession, or simply the thrill of corresponding with a notorious killer. She worked in the prison laundry. She attended chapel services. She remained, by all accounts, cheerful and pleasant. The same warm, giggling grandmother who had charmed her victims into trusting her. She never expressed remorse. Not once in all the years of her imprisonment did Nannie Doss indicate that she felt any guilt for the lives she had taken. When asked about her victims, she would smile and shrug and change the subject, or she would make a joke that left her interviewers unsettled and disturbed. She seemed, even in captivity, to inhabit a reality of her own construction, a world in which her actions made perfect sense, in which the deaths she had caused were simply unfortunate necessities in her ongoing search for love. In 1963, Nannie was diagnosed with leukemia. The disease progressed slowly, eating away at her from the inside, and she spent her final 2 years in the prison infirmary. The doctors who treated her described her as a cooperative patient, pleasant, uncomplaining, grateful for the care she received. She died on June 2, 1965, at the age of 59. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery, her body lowered into the ground without ceremony or mourners. The newspapers that had once plastered her face across their front pages barely noticed her passing. A brief obituary appeared in the Tulsa Tribune, noting the death of Nannie Doss, the so-called giggling granny, who admitted to poisoning 4 husbands and 7 other relatives in a 30-year killing spree. The obituary was 3 paragraphs long. It did not mention the train accident. It did not mention the romance magazines. It did not attempt to explain how a girl from Blue Mountain, Alabama, had become one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The question of motive haunted investigators and criminologists for decades after Nannie's death. Her own explanation, that she was searching for the perfect mate, the ideal romance, seemed almost too simple, too pat, to account for the sheer number of bodies she had left in her wake. 11 people had died at her hands, possibly more. The exhumations that followed her arrest had revealed arsenic in the remains of Frank Harrelson and Arlie Lanning. The bodies of the children were never exhumed, but the circumstances of their deaths, sudden, unexplained, occurring while in Nannie's care, left little doubt about what had happened. She had killed, and killed, and killed, and she had done it with a smile on her face and a giggle in her throat, and she had never once explained why. Some researchers pointed to her childhood trauma as the root cause, the abuse, the poverty, the head injury that may have damaged the parts of her brain responsible for empathy and emotional regulation. They saw Nannie Doss as a case study in the long-term effects of early childhood adversity, a woman whose capacity for normal human connection had been destroyed before it could fully develop. Others focused on the romance magazines, on the unrealistic expectations they had created in a girl who had no other frame of reference for what love was supposed to look like. Nannie had been sold a fantasy, they argued, and when reality failed to match the fantasy, she had responded with murderous rage disguised as cheerful acceptance. Still others took a more cynical view. Nannie Doss, they suggested, was simply a psychopath, a person born without the normal human capacity for guilt, remorse, or emotional connection. The giggling was not a defense mechanism, but a genuine expression of amusement. The cheerful demeanor was not a mask, but a reflection of her true self. She had killed because it pleased her, because it served her interests, because there was nothing inside her that said she shouldn't. The romance, the search for the perfect mate, was simply a convenient cover story, a way of making her crimes seem almost sympathetic, almost understandable, almost human. The truth, as with most things, probably lies somewhere in between. Nannie Doss was a product of her time and her circumstances. A woman born into poverty and abuse in rural Alabama at the turn of the 20th century, raised in an environment that offered few opportunities for education or advancement, married young to a man who treated her as property rather than a partner. She sought escape in the pages of romance magazines, in the fantasy of a love that was passionate and all-consuming, and nothing like the brutal reality of her actual life. And when escape through fantasy proved insufficient, she found another way out. The arsenic was easy to obtain. Hardware stores sold it openly, marketed as rat poison, and a woman who bought it attracted no more attention than a woman buying flour or sugar. The symptoms it produced, the cramping, the vomiting, the gradual deterioration, were common enough in an era before modern sanitation and refrigeration that they rarely raised suspicions. And a loving wife who nursed her husband through his final illness, who brought him tea and broth and never left his side, was above suspicion by definition. Nannie Doss had found, in murder, a kind of power that had been denied to her throughout her life. She had found a way to control her own fate, to escape marriages that had become intolerable, to collect insurance payouts that allowed her to survive until the next husband came along. The romance was real. She genuinely did want to find love, genuinely did believe that the next man would be different. But it existed alongside a colder, more calculating intelligence that recognized murder as a practical solution to practical problems. The children remain the hardest part of the story to understand. Nannie Doss killed at least 2 of her grandchildren, the infant who died in 1945 while Melvina drifted in and out of consciousness, and the toddler who died 2 months later. She may have killed her own children as well, during her first marriage to Charles Braggs, though the records from that era are fragmentary, and Charles himself was never clear about exactly what had happened. Why would a woman kill children, her own grandchildren, her own flesh and blood? The motive that explained the husband's disappointment, financial gain, the search for a better life, did not apply to babies who had done nothing wrong and who possessed nothing worth stealing. Some researchers have suggested that the children were simply witnesses, people who had seen or heard things that could incriminate Nannie, people who might have revealed her secrets if they lived long enough to speak. The toddler, who died in 1945, for instance, was old enough to talk, old enough to notice that his grandmother was putting something strange in grandfather's food. The infant who died may have been killed simply to ensure Melvina's silence, a demonstration of power, a reminder that Nannie could take anything she wanted, and there was nothing Melvina could do to stop her. Others have suggested something darker, that Nannie Doss derived genuine pleasure from killing, that the deaths of the children were not strategic, but satisfying in themselves. Serial killers often escalate over time, moving from distant victims to closer ones, from strangers to family, from adults to the most vulnerable members of society. Nannie's progression, from husbands to mothers-in-law to grandchildren, may have reflected a growing appetite for violence, a need for ever more intimate killings to achieve the same psychological satisfaction. We will never know for certain. Nannie Doss took her secrets to the grave, smiling and giggling to the end. The case of Nannie Doss had lasting effects on American criminal justice, though not always the effects that one might expect. Her crimes helped to popularize the concept of the Black Widow killer, a woman who murders multiple husbands for financial gain, and contributed to the development of forensic toxicology as a routine tool in death investigations. Before Nannie Doss, arsenic poisoning was often overlooked, attributed to natural illness or bad food. After her case, medical examiners became more likely to order toxicological screens when the circumstances of a death seemed suspicious. Dr. Schwesinger's decision to order an autopsy over the widow's objections, a decision that ultimately led to Nannie's arrest, became a standard teaching case in forensic pathology textbooks. The case also contributed to changes in how life insurance was sold and monitored. Insurers began to look more carefully at policies taken out by spouses, particularly when the policies were purchased shortly before the insured party's death. The pattern that Nannie had exploited, marrying a man, insuring him without his knowledge, and then poisoning him, became a red flag that triggered automatic investigation. These changes did not eliminate insurance-motivated murders, but they made them more difficult to commit and more likely to be detected. And yet, in some ways, the most lasting legacy of Nannie Doss was cultural rather than legal. She became, in the decades after her death, a figure of dark fascination, a character who appeared in true crime books and television documentaries, and even eventually in a made-for-TV movie that aired in 1983. The giggling granny entered the American cultural imagination as a symbol of something deeply unsettling. The idea that evil could wear a pleasant face, that the woman next door could be a killer, that the warm smile and the homemade pie could be masks concealing something monstrous. The image was not entirely accurate, of course. Nannie Doss was more complicated than the caricature suggested, damaged as well as dangerous, a victim as well as a victimizer. But the caricature served a purpose. It reminded Americans that appearances could deceive, that trust should not be given automatically, that even the most domestic and unthreatening-seeming people were capable of terrible things. It was a lesson that the country would learn again and again in the decades to come, as other cases emerged, Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, that challenged assumptions about what killers were supposed to look like. Nannie Doss had looked like a grandmother. She had smiled like a grandmother. She had giggled and served tea and welcomed guests into her home with warmth and hospitality. And she had killed 11 people, probably more, without ever seeming to feel a moment's guilt. In Blue Mountain, Alabama, the Hazel family home has long since crumbled into ruin. The cotton mill where Nancy worked as a young woman closed decades ago. The town itself has dwindled to almost nothing. A handful of houses and a general store and a church that holds services every other Sunday. No one there remembers the Hazel family anymore. No one tells stories about the girl who grew up hungry and hit her head on a train and spent the rest of her life dreaming of romance. In Lexington, North Carolina, the house where Arlie Lanning died burned down in a fire that was almost certainly set by his widow. The insurance company paid out. Nannie moved on. In Emporia, Kansas, the house where Richard Morton died was sold after his death. The new owners never knew what had happened there until years later, when a true crime book mentioned the address. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, the house at 507 East Newton Street still stands. It has been remodeled several times since 1954. Its appearance changed enough that it no longer matches the photographs in the newspaper archives. The current owners, according to local real estate records, are a young couple who bought the house in 2019 without knowing its history. They declined to be interviewed for this documentary. And in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary Cemetery in McAlester, somewhere among the rows of unmarked graves, lies what remains of Nancy Hazel Bragg's Harrelson Lanning Morton Doss. There is no headstone. There is no marker. There is nothing to indicate that this particular patch of ground is any different from the patches around it. The woman who spent her life seeking attention, first through romance, then through murder, was buried without ceremony, forgotten almost immediately, left to decompose in anonymity. It was, perhaps, the only fitting end to a story that had no heroes. The detectives who arrested Nannie Doss went on with their careers. Captain Harry Steig retired from the Tulsa Police Department in 1965, the same year that Nannie died. Sergeant Ben Adams made detective captain himself and served until 1970. Neither man ever spoke publicly about the case after the trial concluded. Dr. Noboru Schlesinger, the physician whose suspicions led to Nannie's arrest, continued to practice medicine in Tulsa until his retirement in 1972. In interviews given late in his life, he described the Doss case as the one that haunted him most, not because of the murders themselves, but because of how close Nannie had come to getting away with it. If he had signed that death certificate, if he had accepted the widow's tearful pleas to let her husband rest in peace, Samuel Doss would have been buried without an autopsy, and Nannie would have collected the insurance and moved on to husband number 6. The thought kept Schlesinger awake at night, even decades later. How many other cases had slipped through? How many other killers had smiled and cried and gotten away with murder because no one thought to look closer? The question haunted others as well. In the years following Nannie's arrest, investigators attempted to trace her movements through the preceding decades to identify other victims who might have been overlooked. They found suggestive patterns, a suspicious death here, an unexplained illness there, but nothing that could be proven conclusively. The trail had grown cold, witnesses had died or moved away, records had been lost or destroyed. The true scope of Nannie Doss's crimes would never be known. What we do know is this. Between 1920 and 1954, at least 11 people died after ingesting arsenic administered by Nannie Doss. 4 of them were her husbands, 2 were her grandchildren. 1 was her mother-in-law. The others were family members and relatives whose deaths were attributed to natural causes and never investigated. All of them trusted her. All of them drank the tea she poured, ate the food she prepared, accepted her care when they fell ill. All of them died believing they were loved. And Nannie Doss, the smiling grandmother with the homemade prunes and the Lonely Hearts advertisements, kept searching for the perfect mate until the day she was finally caught. She never found him. But then again, maybe that was never really the point. The romance magazines that Nannie Doss devoured as a girl promised a particular kind of love. Passionate, all-consuming, transformative. They promised that the right man would appear and sweep you off your feet and make all your troubles disappear. They did not promise that you would have to work for it, compromise for it, accept less than perfection. They created an expectation that reality could never fulfill, and they left girls like Nancy Hazel, poor, abused, desperate for escape, with a hunger that no real relationship could ever satisfy. Nannie spent her life chasing a dream that existed only on paper. And when each new husband failed to match the dream, when each new relationship revealed itself to be as flawed and disappointing as the last, she responded not with acceptance, but with murder. The poison was a correction, a way of editing reality to match the fantasy. Each dead husband was a failed draft, discarded so that she could start fresh with a new man who might finally be the hero she had been waiting for. It was madness, of course. It was evil. But it was also, in its twisted way, understandable. The logical conclusion of a life spent believing in stories that were never meant to be taken literally. The romance magazines continued to publish long after Nannie Doss was imprisoned. True romance, romantic story, modern love. They survived the scandal, thrived even, as more and more women sought escape from the disappointments of their own lives. The Lonely Hearts columns continued as well, evolving over the decades into personal ads, and then into online dating services that connected millions of people in search of love. The hunger that had driven Nannie Doss, the need for connection, for validation, for someone who would make everything better, did not disappear with her conviction. It was built into the culture, woven into the fabric of American expectations about love and marriage and the pursuit of happiness. Most people, of course, do not respond to disappointment by poisoning their spouses. Most people accept that reality will never match the dream, that love requires compromise and patience, and the willingness to see a flawed partner as worthy of affection anyway. Most people do not keep a supply of rat poison in the kitchen cupboard, ready to be stirred into the coffee when things go wrong. But Nannie Doss was not most people. She was something else entirely, a product of abuse and poverty and brain damage and cultural conditioning, a woman who had learned early that the only way to escape her circumstances was to take drastic action, a killer who smiled because she had learned that smiling made people trust you. She was a monster, yes, but she was also a human being, shaped by forces beyond her control, twisted by experiences that might have broken anyone. This does not excuse what she did. Nothing could excuse what she did, but it does, perhaps, help to explain it. In the end, the story of Nannie Doss is a story about the gap between expectation and reality, about what happens when someone believes so completely in a fantasy that they are willing to kill rather than accept that the fantasy is not real. It is a story about the dangers of isolation, of desperation, of a culture that promises more than it can deliver. And it is a story about the strange, terrible things that can hide behind a smile. The tea that Nannie served was always perfectly brewed. The prunes were always sweetened just right. The house was always clean, the table always set, the welcome always warm. She was, by all appearances, the ideal wife, domestic, attentive, devoted to her husband's comfort. And if that husband happened to fall ill a few weeks after the wedding, if his stomach began to cramp and his skin began to yellow and his strength began to fade, well, these things happened. People got sick, people died. It was tragic, but it was no one's fault. No one's fault at all. The poison worked slowly, building up in the body over days or weeks, mimicking the symptoms of a dozen different ailments. By the time the victim realized something was wrong, if they ever realized, it was too late. The damage was done. The organs were shutting down. And Nannie was there by the bedside, holding their hand, wiping their brow, murmuring words of comfort as they slipped away. She was a good nurse. Everyone said so. The newspapers of 1954 called her the Giggling Granny and the Jolly Black Widow, and these nicknames have stuck through the decades, repeated in true crime books and television documentaries, and now in this very narrative. But they were always incomplete. They captured the surface, the smile, the laugh, the cheerful demeanor, without touching the depths. Nannie Doss was not giggling because she found murder funny. She was giggling because that was how she had learned to cope, how she had survived a childhood of abuse and a lifetime of disappointment, how she had kept herself from falling apart under the weight of everything she had done. The giggle was armor. It was camouflage. It was the only way she knew to face a world that had never given her what she believed she deserved. In the prison infirmary, in the final weeks of her life, Nannie Doss stopped giggling. The leukemia had ravaged her body, left her too weak for smiles, too tired for the cheerful facade she had maintained for 60 years. The nurses who cared for her described a different woman, quiet, withdrawn, staring at the ceiling with an expression that might have been regret or might have been nothing at all. She did not ask for visitors. She did not write letters. She simply lay in her narrow bed and waited for the end to come. When it finally did, on that June morning in 1965, the prison chaplain offered a brief prayer, and the body was taken away for burial. No family members were present. No friends attended. The woman who had spent her life seeking love died alone, unmourned. Her final moments, witnessed only by strangers who had known her only as a prisoner, a murderer, a number in a file. It was not the ending she had dreamed of. But then again, none of it had been. The romance she had sought was always an illusion. A story told in cheap magazines to girls who wanted to believe that love could save them. It couldn't. It never could. Love was just people. Flawed, disappointing, human, trying to connect with each other despite their limitations. It required compromise. It required acceptance. It required the willingness to see another person's failures as something to be forgiven rather than corrected. Nannie Doss never learned these lessons. She never understood that the dream she was chasing did not exist, that no man, no matter how kind, no matter how devoted, could ever match the fantasy she had built in her head. And so she kept searching, kept killing, kept smiling, until the world finally caught up with her and locked her away forever. The house on East Newton Street still stands. The cemetery in McAllister still holds its secrets. The story of the smiling nanny who served poisoned tea has been told and retold, examined and analyzed, adapted and dramatized. But the woman at its center remains a mystery, a riddle wrapped in a smile, a killer who laughed at her own crimes, a grandmother who murdered her grandchildren and never explained why. Some mysteries cannot be solved. Some questions have no answers, and some stories have no endings. Only the silence that follows when the last giggle fades away.